Thank you, James. I'd also like to thank Claudette Commanda to acknowledge formally that we are meeting and discussing on traditional Algonquin territory. And I'd like to bring you greetings from Treaty 6, my home. I'm going to take a quick canter through Canadian history, focusing on the relationship between Indigenous people and the Crown. Well, I'd hope. Okay. The relationship goes back to the earliest contact in the very 16th and early 17th century. And really, it has always focused the way in which Indigenous and newcomer people have interacted. The first form of interaction, of course, was in the fur trade. And what happened was the creation of commercial agreements between the Indigenous people and the newcomers who wanted furs. For Indigenous people, they could only deal with people they didn't know if they made them kinfolk. They had to go through a set of ceremonies in order to bring them into the circle of their kinship in order to deal with them. And those ties of kinship had to be renewed regularly. And in the fur trade, that's exactly what happened. As this slide shows, you'll see, for example, the puffs of smoke as the two parties are smoking the pipe together. As well, there are formal approaches, formal greetings, feasting, exchange of speeches, exchange of gifts. This is the first form of treaty, the commercial compact. And at the center of it is relationship, kinship, and ceremony. The same is true of what Europeans thought of as the second form of treaty, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, or the Treaty of Alliance. For First Nations, of course, there was no distinction, and for other Indigenous people. As an Onondaga leader said in 1735, "Trade and peace we take to be one thing." They're the same thing. They're both the result of the kin-like relationship between us. And in these treaties of peace and friendship, they are negotiated, they are renewed, they are remembered, in the eastern woodlands in particular, through wampum, such as you see on the screen. And one of the signs of who was the dominant party in these early relationships is shown by the fact that Europeans, and this is Sir William Johnson, the first head of the Indian Department, had to learn how to conduct the ceremonies to make and to renew kinship and to make alliances from the Indigenous people. And they did so in order to be able to function. The relationship within a system of alliance dominates for almost a century. And in the late 18th century, this man, Joseph Brant, Tyendinaga, the Mohawk leader, relies upon the kinship relationship with Europeans and more particularly the Crown to advance the interests of the Six Nations and the Mohawk in particular during the Revolutionary War. And indeed, Joseph Brant goes to London to lobby, to meet the Crown, to make the case for them. The same tradition carries on, the tradition of treaties of peace and friendship, down to the War of 1812, when this amazing Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, formed an enormous alliance to fight alongside the British in defense of Indigenous lands against the Americans who were invading Upper Canada. So the second form of treaties of peace and friendship, in which the Crown is present, is a very important phase as well. The third phase takes us back a little bit, about 50 years. We have to go back to this document, a Crown document, issued by George III, October 1763. It is, of course, the Royal Proclamation. And the Royal Proclamation will usher in a third period of relationship and of treaty making, and one in which the link through the Crown, through ceremony, through kinship, is more explicit than it has been to this point. The Royal Proclamation, as many of you will know, recognizes possessory rights on the part of First Nations in the eastern woodlands, east of the Mississippi in particular. And beyond that, it goes on to specify how they could make those lands available to others if they wished. And the last 6 paragraphs of the Royal Proclamation deal with those lands and deal with giving up those lands to others. And what the proclamation says is, if First Nations, Indian nations it called them, wish to do so, they may do so only to us, that being the Crown, at a public meeting called for the purpose. Every one of those words and phrases is absolutely critically important. It's only through the relationship to the Crown that territorial treaties, because that's what the proclamation leads to, can be made. And it has to be done publicly, and the community has to know what is going on. Shall be done only to us at a public meeting called for the purpose. This is the foundation of the third form of treaty, the territorial treaty, the form that will dominate until the early 20th century, at least. And the territorial treaty making through the protocols and ceremonies of the Proclamation of 1763 are developed, refined, and become entrenched in Canadian practice in Upper Canada particularly between the 1780s and the 1860s. In a series of phases, the Upper Canadian treaties will refine the treaty-making protocol. And through all this, it is, of course, the Crown's representative, the Lieutenant Governor or the Commissioner, who is conducting relations negotiations with the First Nations. The first set of treaties in Upper Canada are made along the front, the waterways, because that is a transportation corridor. The second, back of that range of treaties, and introduces a second element in Upper Canadian treaty making that will become permanent, and that is the introduction of annuities, annual payments, which are, from an Indigenous perspective, a means of renewing the kin-like relationship through the Crown and through the King's people, basically. And then the final phase of Upper Canadian treaty making occurs in 1850 in the Robinson Treaties, in 1862 in the Manitoulin Island Treaties. And these introduce some additional elements. These are for larger territories than the earlier ones. These include explicit recognition of hunting and gathering rights on the part of the First Nations. And these treaties will bring into the treaty-making process and treaty-making record the creation of reserves. While there had been reserves earlier, they had not necessarily been part of treaty. From 1850 onward, treaties and reserves will go together. All this is taking place in the spirit, though the spirit is not always recognized as well as it might have been, the spirit of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And one of the signs of a kind of burgeoning settler society and a weakening Crown influence by the middle of the 19th century is that the use of ceremony and treaty making begins to decline, and it declines noticeably. That's a sign that settler values are overtaking the old values of that kin-like relationship with the Crown and the Crown's people. There's something else that's going on from the 1840s as well that's equally disturbing, and that is Indigenous people are, from the European or the settler perspective, becoming administered people. This slide is entitled Numbering the Indians. It's taking a census of the Indians. As the state begins to assert its surveillance and it hopes supervision over First Nations in Upper Canada. And this ushers in the earliest attempts at assimilative policies, including some of the early residential schools in the 1840s and the 1850s. So coming to Confederation in 1867, then we have two traditions. A tradition of treaty making through ceremony, through the Crown, and a much more worrisome tradition, a tradition of trying to surveil, control, and alter First Nations people. After Confederation, it's the treaty-making one that dominates first. And of course, as you know, in the 1870s, there's a series of 7 numbered treaties made in the West as Canada begins to expand and facilitate settlement in that region. Canada needs access to this region to develop agricultural lands. It needs to create a railway across them to tie the country together, to make it a real and vital country. As John A. Macdonald said, until the railway is built, it is merely gristle. It's not yet solid bone. So for the Crown, the reason to make treaties with the Western nations is perfectly obvious. It's a means to the end of national expansion and integration. What's less obvious is why First Nations would have gone along with it. Western First Nations were numerous. They had a reputation for being warlike. In reality, they're no more warlike than anybody else, but that was their image and reputation. And they were very strong. Well, it's worth notice just in passing that not all First Nations were interested in making treaty. This is one who wasn't at first. This is Mr. Hamasqua, or Big Bear, and he was a treaty holdout till he and his band were starved into treaty in December of 1882. But a more numerous point of view within First Nations leadership in the West, particularly in the Plains region, was a willingness to engage with the Queen's representatives. And the obvious question is, well, why? And the answer is, well, although they are strong still, they are aware there are problems. One problem is, for the Plains people, the basis of their economy is beginning to erode. The basis of their economy, of course, is the bison. And the numbers of bison by the 1870s are visibly declining, and First Nations leaders are talking about it. They're talking about it a lot. As well, there have been epidemic diseases reducing their numbers for quite a few years. And finally, second last, there's been a very serious intertribal warfare, particularly between the Cree and the Blackfoot, that has also reduced their numbers and weakened them. The final thing that's on their mind is that they know that their kin south of the Medicine Line, south of the international border, are having to defend their lands militarily, because the United States, in contrast to the Dominion of Canada, is attempting to conquer militarily the Western nations in order to secure the land completely for settlement and expansion. And all those considerations are very much on the mind of Western First Nations leaders. And they will bring not just their preoccupations and their concerns, but they will bring a very clear strategy to the treaty making. And they'll bring something else back into it. They'll bring back in the ceremony, because they're coming to treaty and the treaty table from a tradition of dealing with the Europeans in the fur trade. That's their most recent contact to the Hudson's Bay Company. And they're used to all the kinship ceremonies that I described before: the welcome, the exchange of greetings, the feast, the pipe, and so forth. And they will bring it back in. Men like this, Mr. Wassis on the front right, Atakakup on the front left. They will be very important in bringing about treaty and bringing ceremony back. We know that this is what they're thinking and this is what they're saying among themselves, because at the making in the first part of Treaty 6, Fort Carleton, in August 1876, the day before they are to begin negotiating the treaty, there is a caucus of the First Nations leaders. And they're arguing among themselves because there are some who don't want to make treaty. Poundmaker initially doesn't want to make treaty, for example. And others, like Mr. Wassis and Atakakup, are making their case for treaty. And they explain all the things I mentioned: the decline of the bison, the weakness from tribal warfare and epidemic, the terrible example across the international border of what's happening to the southern nations. And they explain all this in a long discussion that's recorded by a Métis interpreter whom they've hired and is later published. And when they're bringing their speeches to an end, they both invoke the crown. Mr. Wasis says, "I will take the Queen's hand." Atakakup says, "I will accept the Queen's hand for my people." So the crown is very much in the making of treaties, again in the territorial treaties in Western Canada in the 1870s. An extremely important question about these treaties is also, what is the nature of the treaty? We talk a lot about the spirit and intent, the nature, the essence of the treaty. Well, this is the beginning of a serious problem, or the eve of a serious problem, because there are differing points of view. Government of Canada will take the position that treaties are land purchases. They're contracts for the purchase of land. Interestingly, that's not the way the treaty commissioners spoke during the negotiations in Western Canada in the 1870s. Alexander Morris, for example, who negotiated several of the treaties, says at one point in the negotiation of Treaty 6, "What you have now, you will have then. The treaty will not take anything away, but what I offer is a little bit on top," he says. So in the negotiations, they're not talking about buying the land and taking it over completely. They're talking about sharing, as the First Nations contemplated. But after Confederation, Canada will change. So if First Nations leaders don't think it's a land purchase, what do they think it is? They think it is a covenant rather than a contract. And the difference being, of course, with a covenant, there is not just the two human parties, there is the deity or the creator, which is party to the treaty as well. And they think it's about relationship, the making and renewal of relationship and sharing and assisting one another. So from the beginning, or right after the beginning, there is this fundamental difference of interpretation in the treaties. And what Canada will do, in fact, what Canada does very quickly after the conclusion of the treaties is revert to the use of the Indian Act as the basis of the relationship. The Indian Act relationship, as the Crown interprets and applies it, is the complete antithesis of what First Nations understood they had entered into. It's not about covenant, it's about control. It's not about sharing, it's about giving up and being obedient. Because the Indian Act will treat the relationship as a relationship between parent and child, trustee and ward. And on that basis, Canada attempts to regulate its relations with First Nations down to really the 1970s at least, if not longer. As well, though, Canada will have to make some new treaties beginning in the very late 1890s, when the desire for access for resource-rich lands becomes very strong. And these are the four northern numbered treaties. Treaty 8 in northeastern BC and across Alberta, and a little bit of Saskatchewan. Treaty 9 in northern Ontario. This is a Treaty 9 negotiating party. Treaty 10 in the west, and Treaty 11 up in the territories. The Treaty Commission probably doesn't understand that what they're doing when they approach a village this way is they're reenacting one of the ceremonies of the Fur Trade Protocol. That's the ceremonial approach to the First Nations. The canoes all abreast with the flag flying, basically. So unwittingly, they renewed it. Otherwise, though, in the making of the numbered treaties, the last four numbered treaties, there's relatively little ceremony. As again, settler society values begin to assert themselves and overcome the kin relationship values that had typified particularly the First Nations point of view. About all that remains of the old ceremonialism of the protocol is the feast. And this is one of the feasts that was made in Treaty 9. In Treaty 10 and 11, there's almost no recognition of protocol and kinship anymore. And after Treaty 11, Canada will just refuse again, as it did after 1877 for over 20 years, to make treaty again, because it had enough land to satisfy the needs of its entrepreneurs and developers, and it had no desire to acquire more obligations to First Nations. Only very slowly did this situation begin to change. It took 50 years. Between the Williams Treaties of 1923, so-called treaties, and the treaty in the 1970s. What changes it is, once again, the Government of Canada perceives a need for access to natural resources. In the post-Second World War period, there is an enormous resource-based boom, economic boom, that it really builds the Canadian and expands the Canadian economy. A lot of those resources are located on or under Indigenous controlled lands. And so Canada will be forced, and the provinces will be forced, to return to making treaty again. There's one other thing that's new that is extremely important in the final phase of treaty making, and it's something that the people in this room know very, very well. What's new by the 1970s is the emergence of effective, powerful Aboriginal leadership. And it really comes to the fore with the first modern treaty, the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement of 1975. Because when James Bay is about to get developed for hydroelectric power, there's no intention of dealing with the Cree, the James Bay Cree, and the Inuit of Quebec. Instead, the James Bay Corporation is simply going to develop the power of the James Bay watershed for the benefit of non-native people without consultation. But what's new is you now have leaders who are assertive, who organize, they go to court, they get an injunction, a temporary injunction, soon overturned, but it makes the point. The game has changed. You can't just ride roughshod over the First Nations because now they're organized and have effective leadership. And the leader on the right here, of course, is Chief Billy Diamond, one of the key people in the making of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. There's something else that happens about the same time. In 1973, the Supreme Court of Canada, in the Nisga'a or Calder decision, recognizes that there is something called Aboriginal title in the common law. And that's a game changer too, along with effective Native leadership. In fact, just a couple of weeks after the Calder decision, Prime Minister Trudeau the Senior, is meeting with First Nations from northern BC, and he says to them, well, I guess you had more rights than we thought you had when we issued the white paper in 1969. Government recognizes, federal government recognizes, as the government of Quebec was forced to recognize by the James Bay Cree, that things have changed. And Calder will lead, of course, to the creation of the Office of Native Claims. It will lead to the comprehensive claims process. And that, of course, is a topic, an aspect of treaty, and of kinship, and of the Crown relationship that the people in this room know better than I do. So I'll leave the story there, except to remind you that from the earliest times, particularly in territorial treaty making, the relationship with the Crown has always been at the center of the interactions between Indigenous peoples and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.